They say some cities are built by men, others by gods, but there are a few that build themselves and choose who may find them. In the heart of a jungle no map dares name, gold does not lie buried. It rises in walls higher than the sky, shines in streets that drink the sun, and glitters in rivers that pull you deeper with every step. For centuries, kings, conquerors, and dreamers have hunted this place. None have found it unchanged. Some returned broken. Most never returned at all. And yet, the whisper endures. It calls to those who cannot resist the promise of beauty, the hunger for power, or the hope that they will be the one to claim it. But in El Dorado, gold is not a gift. It is the beginning of the end. The first rumors were no louder than the rustle of leaves in a jungle wind. A city of gold, gleaming under an eternal sun, hidden beyond rivers no map had dared to name. The whispers floated between sailors' cups and campfires, between merchants' bargaining words and a dying soldier's final breath. At first, they were little more than fireside stories, too extravagant to believe. But in the years after Spain's steel and hunger first touched the New World, stories were rarely dismissed. In those days, fantasy and fact bled into each other like water into ink, and greed was the color that stained everything. It was said the city did not just hold gold. It was gold. Its walls blazed with sunlight as if the heavens themselves poured molten fire over its stones. Its streets rang not with footsteps, but with the chiming of coins beneath bare feet. And at its heart, a ruler unlike any other. A king who covered himself in powdered gold until his skin gleamed brighter than the dawn, who bathed in sacred waters to wash away the metal before nightfall, leaving the lake's surface shimmering with the dust of his body. The Spaniards who came to these shores carried crucifixes, muskets, and a hunger sharper than any blade. To them, gold was not just wealth. It was the lifeblood of empire, the promise of immortality through power. But for the tribes who had lived here for centuries, gold was something else entirely. To them, it was sacred, the flesh of the sun, a gift from the gods, too dangerous to keep in one's home for long. It was meant to be offered back to the waters, the mountains, the earth. And it was in this sacred act, repeated over lifetimes, that the whispers of El Dorado were born. The earliest accounts reached Spain in the form of letters written on rotting parchment, stained by the humidity of jungles thousands of miles away. In these accounts, conquistadors spoke of a land somewhere beyond the great Andes, past rivers so wide a man could watch the sun set twice before crossing them. In these letters, men wrote of ceremonies where the chosen king would be stripped naked, covered in gum from sacred trees, and then dusted from head to toe in powdered gold until he shone like the sun itself. He would sail to the center of a sacred lake, plunge into its depths, and emerge reborn, leaving the gold to sink into the mud below, a treasure for the gods. The letters did not agree on where this lake was, nor how far the city lay beyond it. But they agreed on one thing: the path there was cursed. The first man to speak the name aloud in a Spanish port was an old sailor with one eye, his hands trembling not from age but from the memories clawing at him. He spoke of a lake so still it reflected the stars like a second sky, of mountains with faces carved into their cliffs, watching silently as men passed beneath them. He spoke of a city glimpsed only from afar, through the shroud of dawn mist, and of the men who tried to reach it, swallowed by the forest before they could touch its gates. He told of one survivor who staggered back from the edge of the jungle, barefoot and delirious, clutching a lump of gold the size of a child's head. The survivor died within hours, his body covered in strange burns that no fire could have made. Some said it was the sun's curse for stealing what was meant for the gods. Others whispered that the city itself had marked him for death. These stories should have been warnings. But for the men who ruled Europe, they were invitations. In the year 1530, in a tavern near the port of Santa Marta, a group of conquistadors huddled over a rough table scarred by knife marks. Their leader was Sebastián de Belalcázar, a man with scars deep enough to hold shadows, whose armor was more dented than polished. He listened to a young native interpreter speak of a place beyond the mountains where gold grew like fruit from the trees. The interpreter's eyes were calm, but his voice shook, not from fear of the Spaniards, but from the words themselves, as if speaking them might awaken something listening in the dark. Belalcázar laughed. though it was not the laughter of disbelief. It was the sound of a man already calculating. Within days, his men were gathering supplies. The jungle did not welcome them. The air grew heavy, pressing against their chests like an invisible hand. Rivers twisted without warning, pulling them in circles. Food rotted faster than they could eat it. At night, they heard drums in the distance, slow and deep, as if the earth itself had a heartbeat. Some nights they saw lights moving between the trees, not torches, but soft golden glows that flickered and vanished before anyone could follow. The native guides crossed themselves, whispering words in their own tongue, words that the Spaniards did not understand and did not care to. They were here for gold, not omens. Weeks turned to months. The party shrank, not from battle, but from fever, from hunger, from accidents that seemed too precise to be accidents. A man stepping into shallow water would vanish without a splash, as if the river swallowed him whole. Another woke screaming, his skin blistered as if he had been left in the sun for days, though they had marched through shade. Then came the day they found the mask. It lay in the mud at the edge of a riverbank, half buried, its features worn smooth by time yet still unervingly human. The gold was pure but cold to the touch. One of the men, a veteran named Morales, held it up to the light and swore he saw the eyes blink. They laughed at him, but no one took the mask into their pack. Instead, they left it where it lay, but it was gone when they looked back minutes later. The guides refused to go further, saying they had reached the edge of the living world. The Laukazur ignored them, but the further they pressed on, the stranger the world became. Birds stopped singing. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their roots curling like fingers around the path. They found carvings on the trunks, spirals, suns, and shapes that looked like human figures drowning. It was on the 47th day that they reached the lake. It appeared suddenly, like a mirror dropped into the earth. The water was so still that clouds seemed frozen within it. At its center was a tiny island, no bigger than a house, its shores littered with shapes that caught the sunlight, shapes that could only be gold. The air was warm, but the closer they came to the water, the colder it felt, as if the lake was breathing in. The Laukazur ordered a raft built. As the men worked, one of the guides began to sing, a low, trembling chant that seemed to make the air vibrate. When asked, he said it was to keep the lake asleep. None of the Spaniards understood what that meant. That night, Morales vanished. His footprints led into the water and stopped. No splash, no ripple, just silence. The next morning, the Laukazur himself boarded the raft with 3 men. The rest stayed on shore, watching as it drifted toward the island. The air grew heavier with each push of the pole. The gold on the island shone brighter, almost blinding. Halfway across, one of the men screamed. He pointed down into the water, where shadows moved, vast, slow shapes, circling beneath them. The raft began to tilt. The Laukazur shouted for balance, but the wood creaked as if something below was pulling at it. Then, from the island came a sound. Not a voice, not an animal call, but something in between, deep, resonant, like the tolling of a bell made of stone. The raft lurched violently. One man fell into the water and did not come back up. The others clawed at the wood, struggling to keep the raft steady. The Laukazur turned to shout an order, but the words caught in his throat. Something was rising from beneath the raft. The men on shore saw the water swell upward, as if the lake itself were standing. Gold dust glittered in the sunlight, streaming upward around the dark shape. Then the raft tipped, throwing them all into the depths. Minutes passed. The water stilled. Only one man came back. He stumbled onto the shore, his armor gone, his face pale as bone. His lips trembled as if fighting against the words. The men gathered around him, their eyes wide. Finally, in a voice barely more than a breath, he spoke. The lake swallowed the city whole. Then he fell, and the jungle swallowed the rest of his breath forever. They rode into the unknown with banners high, unaware the jungle would remember their names only as curses. The year was 1541, and the air in the port of Santa Marta reeked of ambition. Ships creaked in the harbor, their sails stained by months at sea, their decks laden with barrels of salted meat, muskets, and iron tools that would rust within weeks of landfall. Men gathered in the dusty plaza, polishing armor and sharpening blades. Some were hardened veterans of conquest, others desperate fortune seekers, and a few were men on the run from debts or crimes they dared not speak aloud. All were bound by one lure, El Dorado. The city of gold was no longer just a whisper. Letters from earlier expeditions had reached the Spanish court, filled with tales of a gilded king, a sacred lake, and treasures beyond counting. None of those letters had come from the men who had actually gone in search of it. Yet their absence was seen not as warning but as proof. The gold was real, too precious for any man to return with it. Their leader was Gonzalo Pizarro, half-brother to the infamous Francisco Pizarro who had brought the Inca Empire to its knees. Gonzalo was a man whose voice carried command like a drawn sword, a man who had inherited his brother's appetite for power. His eyes were flint, his jaw carved from stone. When he spoke of the expedition, it was as if the city already belonged to him. They set out with 220 horsemen, 300 foot soldiers, and more than 4,000 native auxiliaries pressed into service as guides, bearers, and laborers. Dozens of hunting dogs strained against their chains, their teeth bared as if sensing the blood ahead. Pack mules carried chests for gold they had yet to find, a quiet testament to the certainty in Gonzalo's mind. At first, the journey was a parade. Drums rolled. Armor flashed in the sun. Children from the villages lined the path to watch the great column pass, their faces a mixture of awe and pity. The mountains in the distance glowed faintly blue in the morning haze, as if dusted with frost. The further they rode, the more the world began to close in. The forests thickened, branches weaving above them into a roof of green that turned day into twilight. The ground softened, sucking at boots and hooves alike. Rivers, swift and wide, cut across their path, forcing them to build rafts or swim their horses. The sun became a stranger. The air grew heavy and damp, pressing against skin and armor until every breath felt like drinking warm water. Insects swarmed in clouds, humming like a constant whisper. They crawled beneath clothing, burrowed into skin, drew blood in the night. Mosquitoes carried fevers that struck without warning, leaving men shivering in the midday heat. One by one, they began to falter. The native guides moved quietly, their eyes flicking often to the shadows between trees. When asked, they spoke little, but their gazes told more than their words. They feared the land. It was on the 12th day that the first omen appeared. A tree, massive and ancient, blocked their path. Its bark was carved with spirals and sun shapes, blackened as if burned into the wood by a fire that left no ash. Morales, a veteran from earlier campaigns, swore the shapes resembled Inca symbols, though they were unlike any he had seen. One guide crossed himself and refused to pass the tree, claiming it marked the border of a spirit's hunting ground. Gonzalo ordered the man whipped until he walked forward. The jungle changed after that. The rivers seemed to pull at the boats, their currents bending in ways that defied their banks. Birds called in patterns that sounded almost like words. Twice they found their camps disturbed in the morning, food stolen, footprints in the mud that led nowhere. Men began to disappear. One soldier, sent to fetch water, was found hours later standing knee-deep in the river, staring blankly ahead, his helmet gone. When they pulled him out, he spoke only in broken fragments, muttering about golden faces watching him from beneath the surface. He died that night without waking. As the weeks passed, their numbers thinned. The jungle's heat warped metal and rotted leather. Rations spoiled. Horses stumbled and collapsed. Disease bloomed in the damp air, swelling limbs and filling lungs with fluid. The cries of the sick became a constant undercurrent to the march. Yet Gonzalo pressed on, driven by a vision only he seemed to see. To turn back was to admit defeat, and defeat was death in the eyes of the crown. Each hardship was merely another debt to be paid once the city's gold was theirs. One evening, as they camped along the banks of a narrow tributary, a scout named Ortega returned from ahead. He was drenched in mud, his eyes wide, his breathing ragged. His hands trembled as he held out something wrapped in a strip of soaked cloth. When Gonzalo unwrapped it, the firelight caught the shape of a face, not flesh but gold. The mask was heavy, its surface hammered to perfection, its features both human and not. The eyes were narrow slits, the mouth a faint, unreadable curve. Age had not dimmed its shine, but something in its expression carried a weight beyond metal, as though it had been made not to honor the dead but to watch the living. The men stared in silence. One reached out to touch it, but Ortega's hand shot out to stop him. His voice was hoarse, the words spilling out between gasps. "I found it hanging in a tree," he said. "No ropes, no branches low enough to reach. It was just there." No one spoke for a long moment. The jungle seemed to press closer, its whispers louder than before. Somewhere in the darkness, a drumbeat began, slow, steady, as if answering the mask's arrival. That night, few slept. By dawn, 3 men were missing. Their bedrolls lay undisturbed, their weapons still beside them. Only the mask remained, propped against a log where Gonzalo had left it. In the early light, its golden face seemed to glisten with dew or with sweat. The water shimmered like molten gold and smelled faintly of decay. It lay cradled high in the mountains, ringed by steep slopes of green that seemed too perfect to be natural. The lake was almost perfectly round, as if carved into the earth by a single, precise hand. The surface was so still it looked like glass, mirroring the pale morning sky and the slow drift of clouds above. But beneath that beauty, something in the air felt wrong. The path to Lake Guatavita had not been kind. The expedition was already splintered, horses lost to swollen rivers, food dwindling faster than anyone dared to admit, sickness threading through the camp. But the mask Ortega had brought back haunted them all, and every step seemed to pull them toward this place, as though the lake had been calling them from the moment they set foot in the jungle. The guides, usually quiet, had grown restless as they neared the lake. They muttered in their own tongue, casting glances over their shoulders, pausing as if listening for sounds the Spaniards could not hear. When asked, they spoke of the Laguna de los Dioses, the Lake of the Gods, a place where the Muisca people had come for centuries to make offerings. Gold, emeralds, and sacred objects were cast into the waters, gifts for the spirits that dwelled beneath. But the offerings were not given freely. They were payment to keep something in the lake asleep. They told of a king who had been chosen not by birth, but by omen. He would be stripped of clothing, his body coated in resin, and then dusted from head to toe with gold powder until he gleamed like the sun. Standing upon a raft, he would be rowed to the lake's center, where he would dive into its depths. When he rose again, the gold would be gone from his skin, and the gods would be satisfied for another year. The Spaniards heard only the part about the gold. That morning, the wind carried a strange smell, the sweetness of wet earth mixed with something sharper, like metal. The water's golden shimmer was not from coins but from dust drifting upon the surface, scattering light into 1,000 shards. The men stood in silence, staring. Gonzalo Pizarro broke it first. "We'll take what the savages have thrown away." The guides recoiled at his words. One, an old man with white painted lines across his face, stepped forward. His voice trembled, but his gaze was steady. "The watcher waits beneath. If you take what is his, he will take you." Laughter rippled through the soldiers, but it was thin, uneasy. Gonzalo ignored the warning, already ordering men to prepare a raft. They would search the shallows first, then dive deeper. Every man who could swim was to be ready. Clouds began to gather as they worked. At first, they were the soft gray of rain, but within an hour they had thickened into a mass the color of bruises. The wind rose, carrying with it a chill that cut through the humidity. The surface of the lake rippled once, twice, then went still again as though nothing had disturbed it. By midday, the raft was ready. It was little more than lashed logs bound with rope, but it would hold 4 men at a time. Ortega, who had found the mask, volunteered to be among the first. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the center of the lake. The old guide stood on the shore, chanting softly, his words carried away by the wind. The soldiers pretended not to hear, but some touched the small crosses hanging from their necks. The raft pushed away from shore. The water darkened quickly, turning from green to black. Beneath its surface, shapes moved, not clearly enough to be seen, but enough to make the men glance downward again and again. Ortega reached into the water once, pulling his hand back with a hiss. His skin felt colder than it should, as if the lake's touch had stolen heat from his blood. At the center, the raft stopped. The men leaned over the edge, peering into the depths. Something gleamed far below. A coin? A chain? The sunlight refracted strangely, as though the lake were deeper than it had any right to be. Gonzalo ordered them to dive. The first man slipped beneath the surface with barely a splash. The cold hit him instantly, pressing into his chest, turning his limbs heavy. He kicked downward, eyes open, the water around him murky yet filled with flickers of gold. His fingers brushed something solid, a mask, a plate, maybe an idol, and in that instant, a shadow passed over him. It was vast. Not fish, not man. Its movement was slow, deliberate, and it blocked what little light reached him. A sound vibrated through the water, low and resonant, a note that seemed to thrum inside his bones. Panic surged. He kicked upward, lungs burning, certain something was rising after him. He broke the surface gasping, clutching nothing in his hands. His eyes were wide, wild. "There's something," he began, but the words cut off as he coughed violently. The others mocked him at first, calling him coward, until the second man dove. This one stayed longer. When he finally surfaced, his face was pale, and he was shaking. "I saw a street," he whispered. "A street of gold, beneath the water." He swore he had seen figures moving along it, their faces hidden, their hands raised as if in greeting or warning. Before they could question him further, thunder cracked overhead. The wind whipped across the lake, churning its surface. Rain began to fall, heavy and sudden, drumming against wood and water alike. The raft pitched, forcing the men to cling to its edges. From the shore, the guides began shouting, their voices urgent. The old man was no longer chanting. He was yelling for them to return. Gonzalo refused, demanding one more dive before the storm grew worse. Ortega volunteered. He slipped into the water without hesitation. The cold gripped him instantly, but he forced himself down. Light faded quickly. Below, he saw them, shapes of gold scattered across the lakebed, glittering in the dimness. Masks, coins, ornaments, all resting as if on display. And then he saw the eyes. 2 points of light, far larger than any man's, watching from the darkness. They did not blink. They did not move. But he felt the weight of their gaze pressing into him, holding him still. The water around him shifted, as though something massive had changed position. A current caught him, dragging him sideways. His hand closed around one of the golden masks, instinct overriding sense. The moment he touched it, the water seemed to roar in his ears. The pressure in his chest doubled, pain lancing through his skull. He kicked upward, desperate for air. The surface felt impossibly far. The eyes followed. When he finally burst through, the scream tore from him before he could draw breath. His body convulsed, his hands clutching the mask so tightly his knuckles were white. Water poured from his mouth, but it was not just water. It was gold dust. The wind howled across the lake. The guides turned away. The storm broke in full, and the lake's surface closed over again, as still and perfect as before. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It clung to the skin, soaked the bedding, and turned the ground beneath the tents into a slow-moving soup of mud. The air smelled of damp wood and iron, and somewhere in the distance, frogs croaked with maddening regularity. What was left of Gonzalo Pizarro's expedition huddled beneath canvas and rotting palm fronds, nursing wounds and watching the storm swallow the mountains. In a candlelit tent at the center of the camp, a table had been cleared. The map lay there, its edges curled from moisture, its surface scarred with the marks of travel. It had been taken from the belongings of a dying trader 2 weeks earlier, a man who had wandered into their path delirious and near blind from fever. He had clutched the map as if it were his own beating heart, refusing to let go even as the last of his strength drained away. The map was unlike any they had seen. Rivers sprawled across the parchment in black ink, twisting and doubling back like serpents in a frenzy. Some branched into tributaries that abruptly ended in nothing. Others looped in perfect circles. The mountains were drawn not as peaks but as looming faces, their eyes closed, their expressions unreadable. And at the far edge, where the rivers converged, There was only emptiness, a blank space where the parchment was oddly smooth, untouched by ink. Gonzalo leaned over it, candlelight trembling across his weathered face. His hands hovered above the blank space. "This is where we go," he said quietly, as though the tent itself might be listening. The men exchanged glances. They had lost too many to storms, sickness, and what lay beneath Lake Guadavita. But gold was gold, and even the most exhausted among them felt the pull. That night they found the guide. He appeared at the edge of camp just after sunset, stepping out from the curtain of rain as if it had birthed him. He was tall for his people, his hair bound in a single braid, his bare chest painted with black and red patterns that shifted with every movement. His eyes were dark and deep-set, and they held the kind of stillness that comes from staring too long into the same horizon. He spoke the Spaniard's tongue with a slow, deliberate weight. "You seek the place at the edge of the rivers," he said. "I can take you there." When they asked his name, he only shook his head. "Names are for those who return," he replied. That first night, he sat alone by his fire, burning herbs that smelled sharp and bitter. Long after the others had slept, he could be heard murmuring in a low voice, words that did not belong to the jungle's natural sounds. In the morning, the men noticed a thin line of ash circling the guide's bedroll, unbroken except where his feet had stepped over it. They marched again. The rivers became their constant companion, always ahead, beside, or behind, but never in the same place for long. Some seemed to flow backward. Others bent in ways that made no sense, curving toward the same point regardless of the direction they approached. The guide walked ahead, pausing at certain trees to press his palm against the bark, his lips moving in silent prayer. It was on the fourth day with him that they found the first bones. They lay in a clearing where no undergrowth grew, the soil pale and dry despite the rain. The bones were arranged in precise spirals, each curve leading inward to a single skull resting on its side. The empty eye socket faced the path they had come from. The guide stopped. His gaze lingered on the skull, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low but steady. "We are near the edge of the living world." The soldiers shifted uneasily. Morales, who had been with Gonzalo since the first day, spat into the dirt. "The only edge I see is the edge of our patience." But even as he spoke, he did not step forward. The guide knelt by the skull, brushing away a thin layer of dust to reveal carvings etched into the bone. They were lines and curves, like the rivers on the map, intersecting at impossible angles. "These are the paths," he said. "They do not belong to us. They do not forgive trespass." That night, no one spoke loudly. The guide burned more herbs, the smoke curling in thin threads that seemed to vanish faster than the wind could take them. From the darkness beyond the camp, something watched. They could feel it, not in the way one senses an animal's eyes, but deeper, like the weight of a shadow leaning across the soul. The next day, the jungle began to change. The trees grew taller, their trunks impossibly straight, their canopies blotting out the sky entirely. The air was still, the usual hum of insects gone. The only sound was the river, gurgling softly like distant laughter. Once, they saw a bird, its feathers so bright it seemed to glow, but it made no sound, and its eyes were the same flat black as the guide's. By the second evening, they were lost. The map's rivers no longer matched the ones before them. The guide claimed they were following the true path, but even Gonzalo's certainty had begun to crack. Men muttered at night, speaking of turning back, of abandoning the quest before they joined the bones they had passed. It was then that the map changed. They had stopped in a dry patch beneath the roots of a massive tree, its trunk wide enough to shelter all of them from the rain. Gonzalo unrolled the parchment, spreading it on the ground between the flickering candles. The ink was wet, not smeared, wet as though freshly drawn. The rivers glistened, their black lines seeming to pulse faintly, as if alive. The guide's expression darkened. He crouched beside the map, his long fingers hovering over the blank space. "It's waking," he whispered. Before anyone could ask what he meant, a drop of crimson appeared on the parchment. It spread slowly, seeping into the smooth, untouched area, staining it like wine spilled into water. The men watched in silence as the red deepened, curling outward in thin veins, branching like the rivers themselves. Then the candlelight caught the stain, and it glimmered. Not red. The guide stood abruptly. "Do not touch it," he ordered, his voice sharper than before. "It will take more than you can give." But Gonzalo was already leaning closer, his eyes fixed on the shimmering veins. In the glow of the candles, it looked as though the map itself were bleeding gold, flowing toward some unseen center deep within the blank space. The guide stepped between him and the map, his shadow cutting across the golden stain. His voice was quiet now, but there was steel in it. "If you follow this, you will not return. The map does not lead you, it leads itself. And it always arrives at the same place." Gonzalo's lips tightened. "Which is?" The guide looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Where the living do not belong." The wind picked up outside, rattling the canvas. Somewhere in the darkness, a branch cracked, though no storm had come. The candles flickered, and on the ground, the gold continued to spread, curling outward like a serpent searching for prey. They thought they were hunting a city. By nightfall, they realized something was hunting them. The jungle was different now. The air itself seemed to lean in, heavy with an unnatural stillness. No birds called. No insects droned. The only sound was the rustle of their own boots in the undergrowth and the slow creak of leather and armor. Even the river they followed had grown silent, its usual chatter replaced by a slow, steady current that whispered against the banks. The guide walked ahead, his shoulders tense, his bare feet leaving almost no trace on the damp ground. At intervals, he would stop without warning and kneel beside a stone, sometimes just a lump of rock half buried in moss, other times a carved slab etched with spirals and sunbursts. From a pouch at his side, he would draw a sliver of gold, a coin, a bead, a thin disc no bigger than a fingernail. He would place it carefully on the stone, mutter a prayer, and only then continue. The soldiers watched him with unease. Gold was what they had come for, not to throw away into the dirt. But Gonzalo did not stop him. There was a hard edge in the guide's eyes when he worked, and something about his stillness made even the most defiant among them hold their tongues. By midday, the trees began to change. Their trunks twisted unnaturally, coiling upward like ropes, their roots bulging out of the soil in thick knots that forced the men to climb and crawl. Patches of the jungle floor were covered in leaves that crunched underfoot despite the wet air, as though they had been lying there for years without decay. The path wound in strange arcs, doubling back in ways none of them noticed until they recognized a fallen tree they had already passed hours earlier. When they stopped to rest, Morales swore under his breath. "We're going in circles." The guide glanced at him without expression. "The city moves. You think you follow it, but it walks ahead. Sometimes it walks behind." Morales spat into the dirt. "Cities don't walk." The guide only smiled, a thin, joyless curve of the lips. "This one does." They pressed on. That night, they made camp in a narrow clearing bordered by stones that jutted from the earth like broken teeth. The guide walked the perimeter, placing small pieces of gold at each point where the stones met the ground. "To keep the spirits out," he said when questioned. The men laughed, but not as loudly as before. The darkness beyond the clearing seemed too thick, the trees too still. The fire they built burned high, but the shadows it cast did not seem to move naturally. They flickered against the trunks, sliding in ways that did not match the flames. Then, somewhere far off, came the sound of a branch snapping. Every man froze. Gonzalo signaled for silence, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The guide closed his eyes, muttering low in his own tongue. The snapping came again, closer now, followed by the faint hiss of something moving through leaves. The first arrow struck without warning. It hissed out of the darkness and buried itself in the ground beside the fire, its shaft vibrating. The second struck a man in the shoulder, knocking him backward with a cry. Chaos erupted. Swords were drawn, muskets snatched up, torches swung toward the treeline. But the enemy was unseen, only the flash of movement between trees, the glint of something metallic before vanishing again. Arrows rained in short bursts, never from the same place twice. One man went down with a shaft through his throat, another stumbled clutching his leg. The jungle seemed to breathe around them, each sound coming from a different direction, each movement vanishing before it could be aimed at. The guide shouted for them to stay within the circle of stones. "Outside is theirs," he warned. The fight dragged on until the fire began to gutter, the torches burning low. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the arrows stopped. The clearing fell silent once more. No one slept that night. The wounded moaned softly. The rest sat with weapons in hand, eyes fixed on the dark. The guide burned herbs again, the acrid smoke mixing with the metallic scent of blood. When the first light of dawn began to seep into the clearing, Gonzalo ordered the men to pack quickly. They moved in tense silence, eager to put distance between themselves and the unseen attackers. But when the last bedroll was gathered and the embers kicked over, they discovered someone was missing. It was Ortega. His bedroll lay where it had been, his sword and pack untouched. But the damp soil beside it told another story. A line of footprints, deep and deliberate, leading out of the clearing. They were not hurried. There were no signs of a struggle, no dragging marks, no blood. The prints led into the trees. And they led deeper, always deeper, as if willingly taken. Months later, in a distant port far from the steaming jungles, a stranger walked in from the mist. The dockworkers saw him first, a thin figure in ragged clothes, moving with the slow, uneven gait of a man who had walked too far without stopping. His skin clung to bone, his cheeks hollow, his lips cracked and colorless. His eyes, they were the eyes of someone who had looked into something so vast, so incomprehensible, that part of him was still staring into it. In his arms, wrapped in strips of filthy cloth, he carried a single brick of gold. It was rough, unpolished, as though torn from some ancient wall rather than forged by human hands. Its surface was dented, its edges worn smooth by time. Yet even beneath the grime, it gleamed faintly in the pale light, a gleam that seemed almost reluctant, as if the gold itself did not want to be seen. He said nothing as he passed the dockworkers. He simply walked into the heart of the port town and disappeared into the shadows of a small tavern near the waterfront. The tavern was dim, its air heavy with the smell of salt, rum, and old wood. A few sailors hunched over their cups looked up as he entered, but most turned away. Men with haunted eyes and strange treasures were not rare in port towns. But this man's presence carried something different, an invisible weight that made conversation falter and the fire seemed to burn lower. It was the innkeeper who finally spoke to him. "You've come far," he said cautiously. The stranger nodded once. His voice, when it came, was rough, like dry leaves scraping stone. "Further than I should have." By nightfall, the story had begun to spread. A survivor of the lost expedition. The only one who had made it back. Some said he had been found drifting on a raft. Others claimed he had walked out of the jungle alone. All agreed on one thing. The gold he carried was not ordinary. The next day, a small group gathered in the back room of the tavern. Merchants, sailors, one priest, and the port's governor, drawn by the promise of hearing what had happened in the jungle. The man sat hunched over a cup of water, his long fingers curling around it as though afraid it would vanish. He began slowly, as if the words themselves were heavy. "They're gone," he said. "All of them. Gonzalo, Morales, Ortega," he trailed off, blinking hard. "I don't know how many days passed before I realized I was alone. The city was close. I could feel it. But every time we tried to reach it, the trees would shift. The rivers would bend away. Sometimes we walked for hours only to find ourselves back where we began." He swallowed, his eyes drifting somewhere far beyond the walls. Then the dream started. The room was silent. "I saw streets paved in sunlight," he whispered. "Not lit by the sun we know, but by something older. The walls were gold, but it wasn't the gold of coins or treasure. It was alive. It moved. It watched. And there was a man, or something like a man, standing at the center. He wore a mask that covered his whole face, a mask with no eyes, no mouth, but somehow it smiled. When I tried to walk toward him, the streets bent. The ground flowed like water, carrying me away." He rubbed at his temples as if to push away the memory. "Sometimes I'd wake and we were still walking. Other times I'd wake and I was alone." The priest leaned forward. You saw this city with your own eyes? The man shook his head slowly. I don't know if my eyes saw it, or if it was inside me all along. He coughed suddenly, a wet, tearing sound, and when he lowered his hand from his mouth, there was a thin streak of blood across his knuckles. The governor frowned. You're unwell. Perhaps we should. No. The man's voice was sharp now, desperate. You have to hear the rest. He told them of the rivers flowing backward, of the nights where the moon hung motionless in the sky, of the voices whispering in languages no man should know. He spoke of following Ortega's footprints after the attack, finding them ending abruptly in the middle of a dry stream bed, as though Ortega had stepped into the air and never come down. His words grew faster, more fractured. I think the city moves when it wants to be found. But it's not a place. Not really. It's a hunger. It watches you until you can't look away. It changes you. Another drop of blood slid from his nose. He didn't notice. I don't remember leaving. I remember light, and then the jungle, and then the sea. And this, he tapped the brick of gold, still wrapped in its filthy cloth. I don't remember taking it. I woke and it was in my hands. The merchants leaned in, their greed momentarily overcoming their unease. Where? One asked. Where did you see this? The man's gaze fixed on the wall as though looking through it. Everywhere, he murmured. It's everywhere now. His hands began to tremble. His breathing quickened. He clutched the gold tighter, his fingers digging into it until the knuckles turned white. You can't keep it, he whispered. It doesn't belong here. It doesn't belong anywhere. The governor reached forward, perhaps to calm him, perhaps to take the gold. The man recoiled violently. His eyes darted to each face in the room, wild, as if seeing something beyond them. It's here, he said. It followed me. Blood poured from his nose now, dripping onto the table, seeping into the wood. His body shook. The gold brick seemed heavier in his arms, though no one touched it. I saw the king again, he rasped. He was closer this time. He reached out his hand and... The words cut off mid-sentence. His body stiffened, eyes wide, staring at nothing. His hands remained clenched around the invisible shape of the gold, though the brick itself had slipped from his grip and landed on the floor with a dull, unnatural thud. When they pried his fingers open, they found nothing inside. Yet his hands stayed frozen that way, as if still holding something the rest of the world could not see. It was a cold, wet night in Port Royal when the map resurfaced. Not in the hands of an explorer or a soldier, but on a table in the back room of a black market auction, where men with dangerous eyes and heavier purses gathered to buy what should never have been for sale. The auctioneer wore a dark coat that brushed the floor, his voice low enough that every man leaned forward to hear him. Our final item tonight, he said, comes without a name, but carries one warning. He set the rolled parchment on the table. Its edges were frayed, its color aged to the dull brown of something that had passed through too many hands. A red wax seal, cracked and brittle, held it shut. Written across the outside in a careful, almost reverent hand were 4 words: property of the damned. The murmurs began immediately. The bidders were not the usual crowd of petty thieves and drunken sailors. They were men, and a few women, whose lives had already brushed against darkness. Smugglers who had run cargo for warlords, scholars dismissed from universities for heresy, and even a pair of pale-eyed occultists dressed all in black. To each of them, gold was a lure, but power was the prize. The auctioneer said the map had been recovered from the wreck of a Spanish galleon off the coast of Cartagena. The ship had been bound for Madrid but never arrived. Those who found her swore her decks were littered with bones, though no storm had touched her and no wound marked her hull. The map was found locked inside a chest in the captain's quarters, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with iron wire. It was unrolled now for the first time in public. The parchment was covered in rivers, twisting like black serpents, flowing toward a blank space at the far edge. Around the rivers were marks, strange clusters of dots, arcs, and symbols that no one in the room recognized. They were not letters, not numbers, but something older, something more deliberate. One of the scholars in the crowd spoke first. "Those are star charts," he murmured. "But strong. They don't match any sky I've ever seen." The occultists leaned forward, their eyes shining. One of them whispered, "They will, when the moon is right." The bidding began. Gold coins clinked onto the table, rings slipped from fingers, entire purses of silver tossed forward. But the man who won it was not the richest bidder. He was a smuggler named Nathaniel Briggs, a man known for carrying goods no sane sailor would touch. Rumor claimed he had sailed upriver into the Amazon and returned with crates of black stone that whispered when the tide was high. Briggs did not smile when the map was handed to him. He touched it like something alive. That night, he rented a room above the tavern, barred the door, and lit a single candle. From his coat, he pulled a flask of clear rum, took a swallow, and unrolled the map again. The parchment was beautiful in its own way, the rivers so precisely inked they seemed almost to move. But it was the symbols, those alien constellations, that held his attention. They pulled at the mind, the way certain dreams do, leaving the sense that you almost understand something far beyond you. Without quite knowing why, Briggs opened the window. The moon was full, its light pale and cold as it spilled into the room. When it touched the map, something changed. The symbols began to glow. Not brightly, not enough to light the room, but enough to be unmistakable. Lines appeared between them, connecting the dots into strange shapes, not constellations as any sailor would know them, but patterns that resembled eyes, hands, and spirals. The rivers darkened, their ink becoming almost wet, as though the map were freshly drawn. And in the blank space at the edge, the smooth parchment was no longer smooth. Tiny symbols bled upward, curling into existence as if the moonlight itself was writing them. Briggs sat frozen, his hand gripping the table. He had heard the stories of El Dorado, but none had spoken of this, of a map that came alive under the moon, of a destination that only revealed itself when the sky turned just so. By morning, he had made his choice. The map did not stay secret for long. In ports from Havana to Kingston, word spread of a smuggler with a chart to the lost city. Soon others sought him out. Treasure hunters from Lisbon, mercenaries from New Orleans, a French naturalist obsessed with cataloging the flora of the Amazon, and a woman named Isolde, who wore an iron key around her neck and claimed her great-grandfather had died searching for the same place. Each came for their own reasons, but all understood the truth. This was no mere hunt for gold. The whispers spoke of a power older than the city itself, a force the Muisca kings had guarded not to protect themselves, but to protect the world from it. They left Port Royal in secrecy, sailing under false colors, their ships hold heavy with supplies. The map was kept in Briggs' cabin, hidden from sight, but each night he unrolled it in secret and watched as the moonlight wrote its message. The symbols were changing. At first it was only a faint shift, a curve where there had been a straight line, a nude up between two others. But soon the rivers began to move, their courses bending subtly, the blank space shrinking. Briggs understood with a chill what that meant. The destination was coming closer, not because they moved toward it, but because it was moving toward them. On the 12th night, Isolde knocked on his door. Without a word, she stepped to the table where the map lay and set the iron key beside it. The metal was black with age, its teeth carved into a spiral. When the moonlight hit it, the key began to hum softly, and the map responded. The rivers writhed. The symbols flared brighter. And for the first time, the blank space was filled. A shape emerged, not a city, not exactly, but a pattern of concentric rings, like ripples on water, with a single dot at the center. Around it were marks that looked almost like writing, but too fluid, too alien to belong to any known language. Isolde whispered, "It's the gate." Before Briggs could speak, the sky outside exploded with light. A thunderclap rolled across the harbor, rattling the window. The candle guttered and went out. The only light was the moon, and the golden fire that now licked the edges of the parchment. The flames spread quickly, consuming the rivers, the symbols, the stars. But where the fire passed, it left behind a trail, a single, clear path that wound through the jungle to the center of the rings. Briggs reached for it, but the heat was too much. The map curled inward, the path still visible for a moment longer, and then the entire parchment collapsed into ash. The wind through the open window caught it, scattering the remains into the night. They say the jungle grows faster here, as if it's swallowing time itself. The path revealed by the burning map had seemed so clear when it blazed across the parchment. A single winding trail through a tangle of rivers and hills, straight to the heart of concentric rings where the city waited. But once the ashes were gone and the expedition stepped into the green, they found that clarity was an illusion. The trees here were not like other trees. Their roots sprawled across the ground in great knotted ropes, their branches bent at impossible angles, as if leaning away from some unseen presence deeper within. The leaves were thick, dark, and strangely glossy, reflecting light in a way that made it hard to tell if it was morning or evening. Nathaniel Briggs led the party, the iron key around Isolde's neck swinging with each step beside him. The rest followed, mercenaries, sailors, scholars, and fortune seekers, each with their own reason for chasing the city. At first, the journey was measured in days, but soon the days themselves began to lose meaning. It began subtly. The sun would rise and set too quickly or linger far too long. A morning march would feel like only a few hours, yet by the time they stopped, the stars would already be overhead. Other times, they would walk for what felt like an entire day only to find the sun still frozen low in the eastern sky. The jungle seemed to press closer with each passing hour. Trees that had been behind them would appear ahead. Landmarks, a fallen log, a patch of white orchids, a peculiar red stone, would vanish and then reappear miles later, as though carried by invisible hands. One evening, they stopped to make camp beside a stream, its water running clear and cold over black stones. They slept, exhausted, under the heavy stillness of the canopy. But when they woke, the stream was gone. In its place lay a stretch of dry earth, as if no water had ever flowed there at all. The change in time was not only in the land. On the 6th day, or perhaps the 12th, a young sailor named Owen woke with gray in his hair and deep lines etched into his face. His voice had grown rough overnight, his hands trembling with the weakness of old age. The others stared in silence as he tried to speak, but his words were slow, his eyes clouded. By nightfall, he was dead. 2 days later, a grizzled mercenary named Hargreaves stumbled into camp looking decades younger. His beard was gone, his skin smooth, his eyes bright with confusion. He swore he remembered nothing of the night before. The fear crept into them quietly. They stopped speaking of days, stopped marking them. No one wanted to know how much time they had lost or gained. And then came the dreams. At first, they were fragmented flashes, a glimpse of a street paved in gold, a hallway that shimmered like molten sunlight, a mask hovering in the dark. But soon, the dreams grew longer, more vivid. They were no longer mere visions but entire journeys through a city of light. Isolde woke one morning with tears on her cheeks. "I saw him," she whispered to Briggs. "The king. He was standing at the center of the city. He held out his hand, and I almost took it." Others began to speak of the same figure, a tall man draped in gold, his face hidden behind a mask with no eyes, no mouth, and yet a presence that spoke directly into the mind. In the dreams, his voice was not sound but a pull, a compulsion, a promise. One man tried to resist sleep, terrified of the dreams. On the 3rd night without rest, he walked into the jungle and never returned. The deeper they went, the less the rules of the world seemed to apply. The rivers no longer flowed in one direction but looped back on themselves. The air felt heavier as though pressing them down. Sometimes they would see movement far ahead, a shimmer between the trees, but when they approached, it would dissolve into shadow. The guide they had hired in Port Royal, a quiet man named Cashin, began to mark the trees with deep cuts from his machete. "So we know if the jungle turns us around," he explained. But the next morning, the marks were gone. Not faded, not covered by bark, gone, as if the blade had never touched the wood. Food spoiled faster here. Water turned sour in their skins. Yet the plants and vines grew overnight, reclaiming any ground they had cleared the day before. In places where they had broken through tangled roots, the earth seemed to heal while they slept, erasing their passage. Briggs began to suspect they were being herded. One night, the moon was high and pale when a mist rolled in from nowhere, curling low across the ground. It muffled sound, dulled the firelight, and carried with it a faint metallic scent. The dreams that night were the strongest yet. Every member of the expedition woke at least once, hearts pounding, certain they had just been walking the city's golden streets. Hargreaves claimed he saw the city's walls breathing. A scholar swore the sky above the city was not blue but gold, a sky that bent downward like a dome. The following morning, they found that Cashin had aged 20 years overnight. His hair was white, his hands stiff with arthritis. But when they asked him about it, he only smiled faintly. "The jungle eats," he said. "It eats everything. Men." And still they pressed on. The path from the map was no longer a clear trail but a pull, a sense that if they kept moving forward, no matter how many times the land repeated itself, they would eventually arrive. The pull grew stronger with each step, but so did the sense of being watched. Some nights, they saw glimmers in the darkness, not the glow of eyes, but a faint, warm light, like gold catching the sun. It would flicker between the trees, vanish, then appear again farther away. A few swore they heard footsteps pacing their camp's edge, slow and deliberate, matching their own breathing. It was on one of these nights that the true fear took root. A young explorer named Corwin was on watch when he felt something cold against his hand. Looking down, he saw nothing, only his own fingers resting on the hilt of his knife. But the cold spread, seeping upward into his wrist. By morning, Corwin did not wake when called. Briggs found him lying in his bedroll, eyes open, breathing slow and shallow. His right hand was no longer flesh. It was gold. Not the bright polish of a coin, but the deep, warm hue of ancient gold, the kind that had been buried for centuries. It caught the light in strange ways, seeming to shimmer even in shadow. The gold crept past his wrist, up toward his forearm, its edges not sharp but blurred, as if flesh and metal were merging into one. Corwin's lips moved. His voice was faint, almost lost in the rustle of the leaves. "I saw him," he whispered. "He touched me." No one spoke. No one moved. The jungle around them was silent, holding its breath. And somewhere far off, they thought they heard it, the faint chime of gold ringing against gold, like footsteps on a street that did not yet exist. At the heart of the forest stood two obsidian statues, but one of them breathed. The air in the clearing was different, cooler and unervingly still. 4 days, the expedition had followed the strange path revealed by the burning map, crossing rivers that ran in circles, moving through jungle that rearranged itself overnight. But here, the world felt frozen. Even the leaves hung motionless, as if they feared to fall. The statues towered above them, carved from volcanic stone so black it seemed to swallow the light. They were nearly identical, broad-shouldered figures, their features smoothed by time yet still holding a faint suggestion of a face. Thick collars encircled their necks, and inlaid lines of gold traced patterns down their chests and arms. Their eyes were narrow slits, angled downward, and their hands rested on long spears of the same black stone. The only difference between them was this: the statue on the right stood utterly still, a work of lifeless craftsmanship. The one on the left, its chest rose and fell in slow, steady breaths. The mercenary Hargreaves took an involuntary step backward. "That thing's alive," he muttered. Nathaniel Briggs said nothing. His gaze locked on the breathing figure, the obsidian skin glinting faintly where sunlight filtered through the canopy. Isolde stepped forward. "This is the gate," she said softly. "It isn't just a place, it's a choice." The breathing statue moved. Its head turned, the grinding sound of stone on stone echoing through the clearing, and its gaze settled on them. When it spoke, the voice was deep, resonant, like a drumbeat heard through earth and bone. "To pass," it said, "you must pay the toll." Briggs' hand drifted toward the pouch at his belt, heavy with coins and artifacts taken along the journey. "Gold?" he asked. The figure shook its head slowly. "Gold is nothing. Your toll is not of the earth." A shiver passed through the group. "What then?" Isolde asked. The guardian took a single step forward, the ground trembling under its weight. "Your past," it said. "One memory, the truest one you hold. Give it, and the gate will open." The men exchanged uneasy glances. Memories were not coin, yet each instinctively felt the weight of what was being asked. The first to step forward was a young sailor. His voice shook as he asked, "And if I refuse?" The guardian's head tilted slightly. "Then you turn back. There is no other path." The sailor hesitated, then placed his hand on the guardian's outstretched palm. The obsidian felt strangely warm. The guardian's fingers closed, and the sailor gasped. His eyes glazed over for a moment, and when he stepped back, there was confusion in his face. "What did you give?" someone asked. The sailor frowned. "I don't remember." "Don't remember what?" He opened his mouth, then stopped. His face paled. "I had a brother," he said slowly. "Didn't I?" His voice broke on the last word, but the memory was already gone, sealed away in the guardian's keeping. One by one, more of them stepped forward. Some gave memories of lovers, others of childhood homes, others of faces they could no longer recall seconds later. For each, the guardian accepted the toll without question. But not everyone was willing. Hargreaves refused outright. "I've bled for every step here. I'm not handing over my mind to some thing." His eyes darted toward Briggs. "You're not doing it either, are you?" Briggs didn't answer. He was watching Isolde. She met his gaze, and in her eyes there was something he couldn't quite name, not fear, but something sharper, almost defiant. She stepped forward and placed her hand in the guardian's. Her lips parted in a small, silent gasp. When she pulled away, her eyes were wet. The guardian said nothing more. It simply turned, spear in hand, and began to walk. The air shifted behind it, as though the space between the two statues was no longer empty but filled with something invisible and vast. But before they could follow, the guardian stopped. Its head turned slowly, its gaze finding Briggs. It smiled. It was not the warm smile of welcome, nor the sly grin of a trickster. It was something deeper, something that carried the weight of inevitability, the look of a being that already knew the choice you would make and what it would cost you. And in that moment, Briggs understood that whatever toll he gave, it would not be enough. The gates opened, and the city unfolded like a dream too bright to be real. It did not happen all at once. There was no creak of hinges, no grinding of stone. One moment, the space between the obsidian statues was nothing more than an arch of shadow, the air inside it dense and still. The next, light poured through it, warm, golden light that pulsed faintly, as if alive. It spilled across the ground, reaching for them like the first rays of dawn after a long night. Briggs stepped forward first, feeling the warmth of it on his skin. It was not like sunlight. It carried no heat, only a strange tingling sensation, as though the air itself had weight and texture. Isolde followed, her hand brushing the iron key at her neck. The others came after, some with awe on their faces, others with the guarded expressions of men expecting a trap. They stepped through. The first thing they saw was gold. Not coins, not treasure, but an entire world built from it. Walls of solid gold rose on either side of a broad avenue, polished so perfectly they seemed to drink in light and give it back tenfold. Towers soared above them, their spires catching the glow and scattering it in sharp, dazzling beams. The streets themselves were paved in golden tiles, each one etched with patterns that shifted when viewed from different angles. Above them stretched a sky that was neither day nor night. It was a fixed, radiant gold, glowing softly without a visible sun. Clouds drifted lazily, yet they cast no shadows on the ground. The air was warm, but it was not the heat of a tropical afternoon. It was the warmth of being inside something enclosed, as though the city itself were a great living chamber. At first, the beauty was overwhelming. The sound of their footsteps rang like soft chimes on the golden streets. The light seemed to erase every shadow from their minds. But then, the wrongness began to show. The shadows that did exist did not fall away from the light. They bent toward it. When Briggs raised his hand, its shadow stretched not behind him, but toward the golden walls. The others noticed too, their unease growing. The air carried faint echoes, but there were no sources for them. No voices in the streets, no footfalls but their own. Yet from somewhere within the gold came the murmur of whispers, the faint suggestion of breathing. The city felt alive. Isolde slowed her steps, her eyes scanning the towering structures. "It's watching us," she said under her breath. Briggs was about to ask what she meant when he noticed it too. The carvings on the walls, figures of kings, warriors, and strange creatures, all seemed angled toward them. No matter where they stood, the eyes of the reliefs met theirs. The sensation was not like being observed by a person, but by the city itself. They walked deeper, passing through plazas where fountains poured liquid gold into wide basins, the streams flowing upward as much as down. Gardens bloomed in impossible colors, the petals of the flowers shimmering as if dusted with fine metal. Yet the air held no scent of earth or blossom, only that same metallic tang, faint but constant. The deeper they went, the more the streets twisted. The map they had carried in their minds dissolved into confusion. A long, straight avenue would bend subtly, its curve leading them back toward where they had come without them realizing it. Briggs began to suspect that the city was not a place you could cross, but a place that crossed you. The first voice came when they entered a wide courtyard. It was faint, a single word spoken in a language none of them knew. The sound did not echo from the air but from the gold itself, vibrating softly beneath their feet. Hargreaves gripped the hilt of his sword. "Where is that coming from?" Before anyone could answer, the walls themselves seemed to hum, a low tone that resonated in their bones. The patterns etched into the street tiles began to ripple, as if they were liquid. Isolde's breath caught. "It's speaking." The hum faded, but the sensation of being addressed, of being weighed, lingered. As they continued, they passed statues unlike any they had seen before. They were not the smooth, idealized figures of kings or gods. These were more human, their features captured in exquisite detail, wrinkles at the eyes, the curve of a lip, the grain of skin. Yet there was something strange in each, a hand too long, an eye too wide, the suggestion of movement caught and frozen. It was Hargreaves who saw it first. One of the statues had changed. He was certain it had been facing the fountain when they entered the square. Now its head was turned, its eyes fixed directly on them. He stopped walking. The others noticed his stare and followed it to the statue. It stood on a high plinth, draped in robes that seemed to ripple though there was no wind. Its face was serene, but its golden eyes were deep and hollow. Briggs took a step toward it. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger. The statue blinked. It was slow, deliberate, the movement of something that had no need to pretend to be human. Briggs froze, the hair on his neck rising. The others stood in stunned silence. The golden figure tilted its head, studying them with an expression that might have been curiosity or hunger. Gold is not the city's gift. It is its curse. They learned this slowly, not with a single revelation, but with the quiet horror of noticing what had been happening to them all along. At first, it was fatigue, a weariness that clung no matter how much they rested. The air in El Dorado was heavy, rich with that faint metallic tang, and though it filled their lungs easily, it seemed to leach something from them with every breath. The first to change was the young sailor who had once laughed the loudest. His steps grew slow. His skin took on a faint sheen, like sunlight caught beneath the surface. At first, they thought it was sweat or the reflection of the golden streets. But it did not wash away. It was in him. The skin on his hands hardened, his fingertips losing their color until they glinted faintly in the light. Hargreaves tried to joke, calling him coin hand, but no one laughed. Others began to change. The edges of their hair stiffened, their nails gleamed like polished metal. When they touched the walls, the gold seemed to cling to them, not as dust but as though the city were claiming them piece by piece. Isolde was the first to say it aloud. "We're becoming part of it." No one wanted to believe her, but the signs were undeniable. Even Briggs could feel it, the faint resistance when he bent his fingers, the way his shadow seemed to lag a heartbeat behind his movements. The city's perfection became unbearable. Every street was too clean, every wall unmarked by time or weather. The fountains ran endlessly without sound, the gardens never wilted, the air never shifted. It was beauty without life, and they were being drawn into it. On the third day, or what felt like the third day, the king appeared. They found him in a great hall at the city's center, where golden columns rose like the trunks of vast trees. The light there was brighter, almost blinding, yet it did not burn the eyes. He stood at the far end, draped in robes of molten gold that flowed as if liquid. His mask covered his face entirely, featureless except for a smooth curve where eyes should be. When he spoke, it was not with sound but with a voice that pressed directly into their thoughts. "You have come for treasure," he said, "but every treasure here carries a weight. Every piece of gold is bound to this place by a soul." Briggs stepped forward. "Whose soul?" The king's mask turned toward him, and though there were no eyes, Briggs felt the weight of the gaze. "Mine. And theirs." Around the edges of the hall, the golden statues stood silent, each one so detailed they could have been alive moments before. Briggs looked closer, at the curve of a cheek, the small scar at the corner of a lip, and realization struck him. These were not statues. These were the city's past visitors. The king's voice deepened, filling the hall. "I was the first. I found the city before it was a city. I took its gold. I left, and it came with me." He raised one hand, the golden fingers moving fluidly. It does not let go. Every coin, every ornament, every jewel carries part of its essence. The more you take, the more of you it keeps, until one day you return to it, and it finishes what it began. Isolde's voice was barely a whisper. "And then you stand forever in its streets, perfect and unchanging. Part of its beauty, part of its curse." Hargreaves swore under his breath. "So that's it? We've come all this way just to end up as furniture?" The king tilted his head. "You came because it called you. The city is patient. It chooses those it wishes to keep. And once chosen, you cannot refuse." The light in the hall shifted, and Briggs realized it was coming from the walls themselves, from the faces of the golden statues, glowing faintly from within. Each seemed to watch them, silent and knowing. Something cold settled in his chest. The city was not a place to be conquered or looted. It was a living thing, feeding on the lives of those who entered, absorbing them into its perfect, eternal body. The king stepped closer. "You may still leave," he said, "but not as you were. A piece of you will remain here, and in time, the rest will follow." Briggs felt the weight of the choice. To stay was to surrender completely. To leave was only to delay the inevitable. One of the mercenaries broke, rushing forward with his sword raised. He swung at the king, the blade slicing cleanly through the golden robes, but meeting nothing beneath. The king did not move. The mercenary staggered back, and where his hands touched the golden floor, the skin fused with it, spreading up his arms until he was frozen in place. His eyes remained wide, alive for a heartbeat longer before the gold claimed him entirely. The others stood frozen in horror. The king turned again to Briggs. "You have seen the streets. You have felt the weight. Will you still take what is not yours?" Briggs did not answer. His eyes drifted to the polished wall beside him, and there, reflected in the perfect gold, was himself. But the reflection did not match his movements. It blinked. At sunrise, the city began to melt. It was not sudden. There was no roar of collapse, no shattering of walls. It began with a sound so faint it could have been mistaken for wind through distant trees, a low, drawn-out sigh that seemed to come from beneath the streets. Then the light changed. The golden glow that had filled El Dorado for as long as they had been within its gates began to dim. Not fade into darkness, but dull, as though its brilliance were being swallowed from within. The polished walls lost their sharp reflections. The perfect streets, etched with shifting patterns, grew still. Briggs awoke to find his boots sinking into the golden tiles as if they were softening beneath him. The edges of the square where they had camped were already losing shape, corners rounding, the crisp lines of architecture blurring like wet paint. Isolde was already standing, her eyes wide, the iron key clutched in her hand. "It's ending," she whispered. The king was gone. His hall, his columns, the statues of those claimed by the city, all dissolving into a fine dust that shimmered briefly before scattering into the still air. The curse of gold was unraveling, yet it did not feel like freedom. Hargreaves staggered toward Briggs, his face pale. The patches of gold creeping up his arms had stopped spreading, but they had not receded. "It's dying," he said, almost in awe. Briggs shook his head. "Not dying. Leaving." The streets beneath them shifted, not breaking apart but flowing, as if the city's foundations were becoming liquid. Pools of gold formed in the gutters and then drained away into cracks that had not existed moments before. Buildings sagged, their perfect symmetry folding inward, their gold sloughing off in sheets that turned to dust before touching the ground. The air grew colder. The sky, that fixed, radiant gold dome, began to ripple. For the first time since entering the city, a shadow passed across it. But it was not a cloud. It was the outline of something vast and indistinct, moving far above, its form distorted as if seen through deep water. The survivors ran. The gate through which they had entered was gone. In its place stretched a narrowing street that twisted like a serpent, the walls closing in behind them as they moved. Every step forward seemed harder, the ground sucking at their boots, the light dimming until only the gleam of dust in the air guided their way. They passed fountains that no longer poured gold but a black, shimmering liquid that hissed when it touched the ground. Gardens withered as they ran past, their metallic blooms collapsing into powder. Statues turned to sand mid-step, their faces crumbling before they hit the ground. And still, the city whispered. The voices were louder now, overlapping, urgent. Briggs could not understand the words, yet the meaning pressed into his mind. "Don't leave. But you belong to me." Hargreaves slowed, his eyes glassy. Maybe we should," he murmured. His hand reached out to touch the wall, and where his fingers met the gold, it held him. Briggs pulled him free with a shout. The gold clung to Hargreaves' skin like wax before breaking away in brittle flakes. The street opened suddenly into a wide courtyard. On the far side, the jungle loomed, dense, alive, and impossibly close. The city's edge was collapsing into it, golden dust swirling into the green as the two worlds pressed together. They ran for the trees. The moment they crossed the threshold, the air changed. The metallic tang was gone, replaced by the wet, earthy scent of the real jungle. The light was dimmer, natural. The sounds of insects and birds filled their ears, a chorus that felt both alien and achingly familiar after the oppressive silence of the city. They did not look back. Behind them, the golden walls folded into themselves, collapsing without sound, the streets sinking beneath the earth as though they had never existed. Within minutes, the city was gone. The place where it had stood was nothing but uneven ground, scattered with patches of strange sand that shimmered faintly before the wind carried them away. The survivors, if they could still be called that, did not speak for a long time. They moved through the jungle as if waking from a dream, though the dream had left marks they could not ignore. The gold creeping along Hargreaves' arms remained hard and cold. Isolde's hair caught the light in metallic glints, though no dust touched it. Briggs himself could feel something heavy in his chest, as though a part of him was still back there, standing in the streets of sunlight. They found their way to the river, then to the sea. In time, they reached a port. From there, they went their separate ways, each carrying a fragment of the city inside them. None would speak of it openly, but all would dream of it. Centuries passed. The city was seen again, but never in the same place. Always it appeared to those who were already searching for something they could not name. Explorers vanished chasing it. Others returned with fragments, coins of impossible purity, carvings of gold so fine they could bend without breaking, a mask whose hollow eyes seemed to follow whoever entered the room. And always, the stories remained the same. The city was alive. The city chose. And the city did not give without taking. In the modern age, the legend lingered in whispers. Historians debated, collectors hoarded, adventurers dreamed. Museums displayed artifacts of dubious origin, each with its own tale of discovery and loss. It was in the basement of one such museum, in a city far from the jungles of South America, that the next chapter began. The curator was a quiet man, methodical, content to spend his days cataloging crates no one else cared to open. One morning, he found an unmarked wooden box tucked behind a stack of forgotten exhibits. There was no record of its arrival. He pried it open. Inside was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, bound with iron wire. His hands shook as he unwound it. The smell that escaped was faint but unmistakable, the scent of rain on hot metal. He unrolled the bundle. It was a map. The parchment was old, but the ink was as dark as if it had been drawn yesterday. Rivers twisted across it like black serpents, leading to a blank space at the far edge. The curator touched it. The parchment was warm. The map lies there, warm to the touch, as if the city is breathing just beneath its surface, waiting for another soul to follow the rivers into the unknown. Perhaps it will be centuries before the gates open again. Perhaps the jungle already hides the streets of sunlight, shifting and reshaping until the right footsteps find them. But the legend endures, carried in whispers, in fragments of gold that surface where they should not, and in the dreams of those who can never explain why the air sometimes smells faintly of rain on hot metal. Some say the city is patient, others say it is hungry. And now you've walked its streets. You've heard its silence. You've seen what it leaves behind. But this is only one doorway in a world of vanished empires, cursed landscapes, and forgotten wonders, places where history and myth blur, where beauty hides danger, and where every discovery demands a price. If you wish to keep traveling deeper into these shadows, if you want to stand at the edge of the map where the living world ends, then stay with us. Like this story, share it with those who would dare the journey, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you never miss the next legend that will find you. Because somewhere, even now, another gate is opening.